On behalf of the ISO, I'd like to welcome you to the Transmission Access Charge Structure Enhancements Stakeholder Meeting to discuss the draft final proposal. My name is Jimmy Bashar with the ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'm also joined by Chris Devon here in the room today, who will be presenting. As with all of our initiatives, the presentation and all related material for this webinar can be found on the Stakeholder Processes webpage located on the drop-down menu under the Stay Informed tab on our website. And then you would notice this specific initiative under the Current Initiatives section. As a reminder, we are transitioning to our daily briefing, which is a one-stop shop email. This will displace all market notices starting November 1st, so we are starting an awareness campaign for this. So hopefully most of you are familiar with that. If not, we encourage you to go on our website and sign up for a daily briefing. Our agenda for today's meeting, as you can see, is to continue discussing how we've shaped our final proposal to address stakeholder input for the hybrid billing determinant proposal. We, of course, appreciate all of the input from you all to date. As most, and hopefully all of you know by now, this is a simple display of our stakeholder process, which, as you can see, utilizes the input obtained by stakeholders between each proposal iteration, after which we carry the proposal forth to our board for consideration for approval. And moving on to the current timeline, as you can see, after today, we will be taking final comments to bring to our board, and the deadline for those is October 9th. In addition, the calls and webinars are recorded for stakeholder convenience, allowing those who are unable to attend to listen to the recordings after the meetings. The recordings will be publicly available on the ISO webpage for a limited time following the meetings. Of course, the recordings and any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. If you have a question in the room, please, of course, raise your hand. And for those on the phone, you can raise your hand by pressing #2, not *2. And for everyone, of course, please state the name and company that you represent. And with that, I'll hand it over to Chris.
All right. Can everybody hear me all right? Okay. Morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. To all those that came in person and everyone on the phone, we appreciate your attendance on this important meeting to discuss the draft final proposal. Thanks, Jimmy, for setting us up this morning. And I just wanted to say thanks to everyone for the flexibility coming in on Monday. We did need to change the date for this to try to avoid some conflicts with other meetings, and so this is helpful that everybody could make it, and we do appreciate it. We know that everybody is not always keen on coming on a Monday early for a stakeholder meeting, so we appreciate that. So with that, I'll start jumping into the actual meat of the discussion here today. So first off, we wanted to touch on our rate design objectives. We've laid these out consistently over the last few iterations of the proposal. So again, just to touch on this, so everyone understands kind of the objectives again, and we just review that quickly. Again, we're really trying to make sure that any of these modifications meet the objective of rate making principles and the ISO's cost allocation principles, which laid out previously in the other background material of the proposals themselves. In previous iterations, and then touch on the major objectives that the ISO is really trying to reflect in this tax structure modification proposal, which is, first off, to reflect cost causation and cost drivers of, when decisions were actually made to invest in transmission infrastructure to meet needs that were identified through our planning process, and as well to reflect the current customer usage and benefits, which may differ slightly from that cost causation originally. So we believe that any rate structure that fairly links those kind of billing determinants with these cost causation issues and benefits that are accruing to users of the system is the appropriate objective to be looking for through this modification that we're proposing. So the major changes, now I just wanted to go over this before we get into the meat of the presentation, but just so that everyone is clear and aware of what we've included for changes to the draft final proposal. Essentially, we have made two changes that we would say, are pretty major for this iteration, but that's really the extent of the changes. The first is to use historic data for setting deriving the 12 CP demand rates instead of using forecast data. This was a discussion that we had in depth at the previous stakeholder meeting and got a lot of feedback from written commentary. So we do agree with the suggestions to utilize historic data after we kind of weighed the pros and cons of using forecast and the potential impacts of using forecast data, and then looked at some of the possible variability and some of those issues related to using historic data, and ultimately came up with the proposal that we think is appropriate for our draft final proposal to utilize historic data. And then we'll talk more about that, and I'll go through some of the analysis that we included in the proposal in our later slides later this morning. The second major change that we included is the addition of a phase-in period, a 2-year phase-in period for this hybrid billing determinant proposal, and that was really driven by the requests from stakeholders that indicated, some uncertainty in our cost impact analysis that we just had to include as part of the normal avoiding of basically revealing confidential load information for some of the smaller entities that we were providing impact analysis for. So with that, we thought it was fair, after we looked at some of their actual settlements info and did a little comparison with that impact analysis that we looked at, and there was some variability there. So we agreed with some of the requests that it would be appropriate to propose a phase-in period to develop this implementation of the hybrid billing determinants. So those are the two major changes to the proposal. Any questions or comments at this point? If not, I'm going to go ahead and get into the hybrid billing determinant proposal aspects of the actual proposal itself. So, okay, let's keep moving. This slide, we're just talking about how we believe the volumetric only approach is no longer appropriate due to the changes that have happened on the system since we've implemented that volumetric approach when the ISO was starting to deliver service. The main issues, we believe that, there's increasing customer-cited DG, possibly shifting costs under the current volumetric approach, where certain areas with more DG production will be shifting some of their costs to areas of less DG production without a accompanying benefit to those areas, and then also trying to align just the idea of that there is capacity and reliability benefits being provided by the system that may not be reflected by the volumetric approach and just the pure energy usage as opposed to add the addition of a demand charge component to the billing determinants. And also, we think that the other major issue that's also, driving this need for this change is also the lower load factor UDC areas and impacts the higher load factor UDC areas. So essentially, we think that just using volumetric approach alone doesn't reflect the impact of areas that have high coincident peak demand with the system, but maybe lower load factor overall, and that lower volumetric use overall throughout the year may not actually really reflect the true costs that those areas are driving. So that's really our justification for making these changes today at this point in the proposal. I'm going to go to the room. Got questions? Go ahead, Paul.
This is Paul Nelson on behalf of CLECA. So you go back to slide 8. So the first bullet and first sub-bullet, you says cost to reduce. Do you mean revenues on that?
Oh, yeah. Thanks for that clarification. So I think that may just be a loose language used out of my part, but essentially the cost allocation that would be applied to those areas would be lower than in areas that have less DG production. So, sorry, the revenues would be, yes, you're
yeah, and then the second sub-bullet on the first bullet, just to get real precise with the language, proposed hybrid approach better aligns with cost allocation with the cost causation of capacity and reliability events provided to the system. Is that sort of then kind of how you're thinking?
Yeah, I think that the intent for both those sub-bullets under the first bullet were to try to capture the cost drivers and the benefits aspect of both of those. So I would say, yeah, that's fair to say. Of course, the cost causation aspect of both the capacity need, but also just the actual benefit that is going to be delivered to customers for using the system on a monthly peak basis. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for that clarification. Sure. Jan, go ahead.
Just again, I think this is just clarification on this bullet, but it's when you say DG production, it's really only behind the meter DG production, which applies here.
That's right.
In this case, in front of the meter DG wouldn't be relevant.
That's right.
Okay.
Yep. Here and then Doug.
I guess I'm a little confused on the cost versus revenues. Don't the UDC areas aren't they responsible for the transmission costs? I guess I don't understand.
Yeah, that was Paul's point, where this one should be revenues. So the revenues in that area with more behind the meter DG production would be lower. It would offset the overall.
Which revenues are we talking about?
The revenues for the transmission revenue requirement that are collected to cover the revenue requirement in those areas, because they would have a lower volumetric load over the year by having more DG. And so we're saying that those entities would be receiving a smaller share of the overall cost allocation, or in other words, a lower revenue that would be generated from the amount of load multiplied by the billing determinant of the volumetric rate. So that's why we think that there's a change needed there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess I was thinking they get their revenue requirement regardless of what their DG production is. So that's what I thought revenue for TR. That's what. Are you talking about like net from what they collect versus what they're owed? That's
right. Yeah, that's right. That's the difference. Yeah. So getting into a little bit more of the nuance of how the actual monthly billing and the allocation goes, where there's that difference between perhaps what we have collected based on the system-wide rate versus what we would collect under the PTO specific rate. And so in general, we're seeing that we believe that the areas with higher DG production may be shifting costs to areas with lower amounts of DG production. Doug?
Yeah, I guess also in the clarification standpoint, is it the notion that basically load reduction in general, whether it's from DG, because it could also be from energy efficiency, or I suppose demand response doesn't typically get you a net reduction, that load reduction doesn't get a benefit to the system overall? Because it seems like any of those, it's not just behind the meter DG production, but anything that reduces load. And on the flip side, that would also suggest that if you increase load in your UDC area, that also doesn't have a commensurate cost. If, reducing load doesn't have a benefit, then presumably sky's the limit on how much you can increase load and doesn't incur a cost, which seems, just thinking my way through that.
I think I'm following your comment, but maybe not. But I think the idea is that the volumetric only approach really doesn't reflect those peak drivers as much when there is a reduction in load. Does that make sense? That's kind of where we're coming from?
Yeah, we're certainly on the same page that the notion of that, but I think the sort of the overall, admittedly, if one area reduces its load behind the meter and say another area proportionally or relatively increases, then that's going to cause money to move from one side to the other.
That's right.
But I'm just wondering about, are we suggesting that those changes in load don't have any impact or don't have any benefit? It's the without benefit part.
Oh, I see what you're saying. No, we're not saying that there's no benefit to doing that at all. We're just saying that the volumetric approach may not reflect that difference in that amount of benefits that are being delivered in different areas. That's really the principle that we're talking about here. Okay, cool. Thank you. That's good clarification, though. So I think, we could be a little bit more clear in the language use on some of these points here on this slide. But the idea really is just trying to, ensure that folks understand where we're coming from about why we think the volumetric is no longer appropriate, and we believe that there's strong stakeholder support from most of the stakeholder community to add a peak demand charge component to the overall billing structure here. And so that's really our just trying to help folks understand where we're coming from on why we want to make this change today. So the proposal, again, this next slide here is just high level explaining what I just said. Again, you know, I think it's an improvement to add a hybrid billing determinant approach, which has part volumetric and part peak demand billing determinants. So, you know, again, capturing both volumetric and peak demand functions and the reliability benefits that are being provided. So, again, like I just said, most of the stakeholders seem to agree this is an appropriate change to make. Some more stringent, powerfully commenting than others, but in general, it seemed like there was pretty good consensus from the stakeholders on that one overall to support this change. So now let's move along and get into the actually setting the rates and how we'll go through that. I'll just give a brief example here that's in the proposal, but just wanted to walk through that with everyone to try to make sure that all the stakeholders understand how this would actually be done when implemented. So this slide is really just trying to explain what we would utilize to determine the actual rates themselves under this hybrid approach. So the ISO will continue to utilize the transmission revenue requirement values from the PTOs that are provided after approved from the FERC rate cases that the PTOs provide to the ISO, and to actually do the bifurcation or the HVTRR split that we talked about. The ISO is going to use historic data, and as well we would use historic data for setting the 12 CP demand rates. So those are two changes from the previous iteration of the proposal. So it's not only that we're using the historic data to set the 12 CP demand charge, but also for the system-wide load factor calculation that we would do to actually bifurcate the TRR so that we have those time periods aligned. We believe that's the appropriate way to implement this. And then again, for the volumetric piece of the TAC rates, we'll still continue to utilize the PTO-specific rate case forecast to determine the volumetric piece. And then again, just noting this last bullet here is just to ensure that everyone is aware that we will utilize PTO-specific rates for how we do the settlements for TAC invoicing. So that's kind of the set of slides that I'll go walk through later to explain exactly how that works again. But that's just to note that we do have the idea of having PTO-specific and then the system-wide rates and continuing that structure where we have the those two sets of rates for volumetric and for the 12 CP demand rates as well. Bert, did you have a question or comment?
Yeah, this is Bert Hansen, Southern California Edison. I'm wondering if you considered using the historic data also for the volumetric charge, because it seems like there could be a mismatch, especially when you consider that some PTOs have rates that the forecast is not updated every year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. So thanks for the comment. And we did think about that, and it may appear that might not be aligned. Might be a little bit of a difference between the historic approach for doing the HVTR bifurcation and the 12 CP demand rate. But if you look at the variance from year to year over the volumetric component, it's very small. I mean, the gross load megawatt hour usage is very small change year over year for most entities, and that forecast is a lot easier for those folks to do, those PTOs to do, compared to a forecasted coincident peak forecast for like the monthly, hourly peak loads. So that's why we think it's still all right to utilize the volumetric forecast for the annual gross load forecast for these purposes. So I think that's a fair point, but the ISO did consider that and looked at some of the variance between year to year. And if you go back and look at each PTO's annual growth load figures, they don't change very much from year to year. So that's why we think it's all right to continue with this, the current process for the volumetric side. Jan, you want to add something here?
Well, yeah, I had the same question when I was looking at this. And so while I respect that the change in the annual peaks maybe aren't that great, that there's not a lot of variation there. What seems more likely, though, is that you're going to have like one really hot historical year where the peak is because really abnormal weather could be really high, and yet your energy values are based on a normalized or expected future year's energy case. So not only do we have time difference, as Bert points out, but we also have this difference between, expected conditions for the energy forecast versus actual weather conditions for the peak number. So it seems to me like you could really sort of tweak the load factor calculations, what it looked to me like, if you don't align the two.
Yeah,
Anyway,
I think one of the reasons that we thought it was all right to continue down this path with historic for the demand side, the demand charge side, and not on the volumetric was that we did want to capture those weather issues that happened during the year, the historic period, for actually doing the split so that we do get an appropriate split in the TRR that reflects the actual historic, high peak load or lower peak load each year and not normalize that piece of it. We'll talk more about that whole weather normalization piece later, but the idea being that, we think that the signal that would be created would be better off if the ISO doesn't do any type of weather normalization on this historic data. And the volumetric piece, yes, it is going to, those forecasts, of course, they do have that, weather normalization included in them. But if you go back and look at the forecast versus the actuals on the volumetric side, those are very close together. If you look at the settlement data versus the PTO filed forecast data for the volumetric piece itself. On the 12CP demand charge component piece, we were not as comfortable with that, and that was why we leaned towards the historic approach being more appropriate there, because we think that the forecasting of that would be rather difficult for some of the smaller PTOs and to get accurately. And also another issue related to that is that the ISO doesn't want to be inserting itself in the PTO rate cases at FERC. And so if the ISO was going to do that forecasted approach where we would have to do some kind of an iterative back and forth process that we talked about at the last stakeholder meeting, that would have ultimately kind of inserted the ISO into these rate cases, because we would be saying this is what the 12CP forecast is for those entities, after we had that iterative process and determined what that coincident peak forecast would be. So there's a couple reasons why we're going back and forth about the idea of using historic, but ultimately we think that even though there is a discrepancy between using volumetric forecast versus historic for the 12CP demand, we think that it will not cause that much of a difference in the ultimate cost allocation and rate design. So that's our reasoning at this point on that issue. And I'm going to go over here to Doug for another question and comment.
Oh, yeah. No, I just I appreciate what you said about that, that there is, I think throughout this discussion, there's always been this sort of underlying theme of simplicity and sort of ease of administrative process so that you're not involved in rate cases. I think that makes a lot of sense. And it's always been this consideration of, yeah, you could add more complexity, but then sort of as an actual estimate, how much of a difference does it make is ultimately, and what you were alluding to of like, hey, we looked at this and it's not that big a difference one way or the other. That, that's always, that trade-off is great, and it's great to hear you guys looking at that.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that comment. And I think just to add to that point, beyond just the fact that we don't see that there's that much variation year over year, especially in the volumetric piece, I think that if there is a situation where there is over or under recovery due to, some large variation or large volatile peak load or, differentiation from the normal traditional historic observations, I think that we also have that for most of the PTOs. They do have that balancing account that then if they over or under collect, they can get that money back into their rate making and process, and then the next year their revenue requirement will be adjusted appropriately. So with that in mind, we don't think this will be, a material impact to the overall, collection of the full, TRR and everything like that. So, okay, we got more questions. I'll go here and then back over to Paul. David, right?
Yeah. David Oliver, Navigant here. probably going to go over details, so maybe I'll just at a very high level. I can see the split will be based on the historic rate. Will the peak or will the demand charge then be the PTO specific demand charge? Will that be historic?
That's right. Yeah, the rate setting. Yeah, so we will utilize the historic period, the same period that we use for doing the TRR bifurcation, as well as the demand charge setting, the rate. Yep, exactly.
Okay. It wasn't clear up there for me.
Yeah, and then we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. But yep, that's the intent. Paul.
Yeah, Paul Nelson on behalf of CLECA. So for the energy piece, I mean, today you already utilized the PTO forecast and the rate setting, and then in the settlement it's historical. So there's really not much change here then, right?
Well, that's right. And the intent is, we already have that process in place rather than switch and use historic, since we already have those forecasts. And again, they're not that variable year over year. We thought that it was all right to continue with the current status quo on that component of the overall structure.
And, in rates in general, you forecast a volume, you forecast, sales or a load, but is going to be wrong, and it's always going to be applied with historic data. So there's
SDG&E gets it right every time on the forecasting.
It all depends on your precision, Jan. You think you're 100% accurate, then you're doing really well. I did have one question though, and I'm not sure where this fits. So if it's best addressed later on, does it make sense to provide a little more specifics on like the forecast, like, it's a 1 and 2 forecast? I don't know if that's ever been done. And then I know there's a parallel proceeding that's been going on dealing with sort of really down into the weeds of some definitions. I forgot what's the
behind the meter production.
That's the one.
Yeah.
And so where that links into this, both, I guess, then it would be on the rate setting and the forecast, I guess. And I don't know where, because that was one of the questions I had. It's some time to ask today, so I'll ask it. If you want to address it later, where it fits better, that's fine.
No, that's fine. We can talk about it now. I might as well get through that. So, and try to answer the question, I guess. But yeah, so just on the first point, try to put a finer point on this issue. We do recognize that there is a difference between using historic for the demand and volumetric for the forecast for the volumetric side. But again, we think that that's still appropriate and won't cause material impacts. So that's really our position on that aspect of it. Now, on the other aspect, let me just try to restate the question, I guess, so that it's a little bit more clear in my mind before I take a stab at answering it. I guess I would say you're just wondering, how does this other stakeholder process that we've undertaken related to behind the meter production, excess behind the meter production, which is when there's behind the meter in excess of the host load producing energy that's then flowing onto the system, how will that be treated in this rate setting process and that sort of thing? That's the question. Yeah, okay. So those amounts of energy the real reason that we're trying to clarify that definition of gross load is so that we ensure that folks aren't netting off that excess production from the overall gross load number that is utilized for the volumetric component of the TAC settlement. And that is an after-the-fact settlements calculation once we get that number in. And so the PTO's rate case forecast at FERC should already incorporate any of that production already. They should be assuming, based off of their gross load meter data that's coming in from their channel 1 on their meters, that should be incorporated into those rate case forecasts currently. And so there shouldn't be a netting or a reduction for anything beyond what is already inherently netted off of the final load from those NEM customers that have behind the meter solar. So that's my first attempt. I don't know if that was totally clear or not. I'm getting a little bit of wacky looks from Jan here in the room, so I don't know. I'll pause and see if anybody wants to ask any clarifying questions, and then I can try to take another stab at it if needed.
Well, this is Jan. I guess what I seem to remember just recently was that the proposal was to treat the exported energy as negative load.
That's right.
So if it's treated as negative load, then the amount of, effectively the amount of load that's used to, allocate or to charge for under the volumetric rate will be lower than it would be if you didn't treat it that way. For example, if you treat it alternatively as generation.
Actually, that's not the case because of the way that we're clarifying the definition of gross load, which is to not remove that negative load from the excess behind the meter production from the gross load figure itself. And that's the major clarification intent of that proposal. So that's where we're coming from with that. Does that make sense? So for energy settlements purposes, your LSC, as the LSC, you would obviously be paying for that energy production and then be paid for that energy production at the same time based on the settlements if it's a negative treatment. And that is a separate calculation and allocation of cost that is done on basically the measured demand side and not the gross load metered demand, which is what we would be utilizing for TAC purposes. And then to just put another finer point on it, again, that gross load figure that shouldn't have that excess production netted off of it would be how the PTOs should utilize their data in their forecasting as well. So hopefully that is all reflected and there's no inconsistencies where there's, improper price formation or improper rate formation or anything like that. And that's where we think, that's where we're trying to strive to go with that other stakeholder initiative to make sure there's no material impact that to issues like what I just mentioned and things like that. So does that help everybody getting better understanding right now and clarity on that? Okay. And then, of course, on that other initiative, we need to do some work on making sure that the way that we do the settlements for that excess production is appropriate. And so there's some more work to do there. But I think as far as this proposal goes, that whole issue can be set aside and separate from this now that we've kind of developed the overall proposal here and think that it won't have a material impact there. So that's that one. Any last follow-up on that issue at all? Okay, let's get into the frequency of peak demand measurement discussion because this one's always been interesting. I think there's folks that have been, supportive of a lot of different viewpoints here. So we got, various feedback from stakeholders. So just to kind of give a brief overview of the idea here, the issue is to do a demand charge component of the tax structure. We need to determine how often we would actually take those measurements to implement that, and then there's examples we've discussed previously, 12 CP, meaning monthly peak demand, or 4 CP, or 1 CP, and so there's, various ways that you could do this. Other regions frequently use 12 CP, some of them use 1 CP, some of them use 365 CP. So there's a number of ways that you could go at this, and we're trying to provide a balance in the way that we have proposed the 12 CP approach. But again, we're trying to align the frequency of the measurements with the benefits that are being provided, and then as well to reflect the way that the system is actually planned and used. So that's really the intent on the number here. And then again, the proposal, which we have not modified from our previous iteration, is to utilize 12 CP frequency. And so that would look at each month what the ISO system coincident peak is, that hourly period. Then the ISO would allocate the cost of the TAC based off of the UDC area's contribution to that overall system-wide peak during that hour. So that's how we would end up doing the billing and the settlements process for this frequency. It would be each month. We think that that reflects the benefits that are being delivered on a monthly basis appropriately. And we also, agree with some of the stakeholder feedback about how they supported this, because there's, going to be monthly peak usage every month, and if we do a narrower definition, that may not really reflect some of the benefits for the capacity and reliability benefits that are delivered each month throughout the year. There's a lot of other reasons to do this that we think help support this. Again, if we use 1 CP or 4 CP, there may be some really large charges for certain areas, so we thought that may not be appropriate depending on, if there was an anomaly where there was a year that the, one CP peak was very, very high that could cause skyrocketing costs for all the UDC areas depending on their individual peaks, of course, but that was one of the reasons why we think 12 CP may smooth that out a little bit but still collect the appropriate component of the TRR throughout the year. And then the other big one is that it aligns with the way that we do settlements for TAC already right now, and it also aligns with most of the retail rate structure that most PTOs have in California as well, with the monthly peak demand type charge from some of their customers. And then obviously some of them with the retail customers, residential type, they don't really have a CP component in their billing, but they may have just energy. But some of the PTOs do have coincident peak type billing structures or non-coincident peak billing structures, but they usually do that on a monthly basis as well. So that's kind of why we think that it aligns well with that component of the PTO's current process. So I'm going to go over here to Doug and then to Jan after that.
Yeah, I think it's actually on the previous slide.
Sure.
It's just sort of the same issue I had pointed out earlier, that since we're looking at anything that affects peak demand, it's not just behind the meter DG, but would also be energy efficiency, or where you have for those utilities that have time of use, you'll see shifts in any battery usage that shifts off of the demand, or an EV charging infrastructure. So it's a whole class of behind the meter mitigation, distributed energy resources. It's just the DG, behind the meter DG.
Yeah, that's right. So point well taken. It is, if there is additional energy efficiency, or there is, a demand response program that's consistently able to reduce their monthly peak, usage, I think that those would all be, reflected in this demand charge. Again, but I do want to note still that we do think that there's, at least one layer of additional rate making where this incentive or the signal may be lost throughout this process. So we're not really trying to necessarily send a signal to the end use customer to adjust their use, but as long as we're reflecting that the benefits that are being delivered and the impact to the system to at least the UDC level, then hopefully eventually at some point in the future those UDC retail rates can ultimately be aligned. But that's a fair point as well, Doug, that it's not just behind the meter DG or like solar NEM installations. It's also anything else that could possibly lower their overall gross load as well. And sorry, not just their gross load, that's for volumetric, their coincident peak load during the month for this 12 CP approach. And then I think, do you have any follow-up, or can we move on? You want to make another comment? Okay.
No, just at the risk of being annoying, but that's my specialty, I guess.
You only get one more iteration.
I know,
this is your last time to be annoying to me.
Be annoying. At least until we show up in the behind the meter.
Right.
Behind the meter one.
Right.
I don't know if you're running that one.
Yeah, of course.
No, it's a point well taken that, and this is something that we kind of commented on, I think, and are thinking about, that one of the issues with the sort of the hybrid demand charge approach in general is it does send a price signal to the UDCs pretty clearly, but there is it's sort of the same issue that exists with the TD interface measurement, that there are more pieces on the retail side to be done as follow-up, which is that's going to be true of anything you do at CAISO involving TAC, because there's always the rest of the universe. So we just sort of like put a flag on that. That's like this is a recurring issue, and I guess I would say that in this case it's good that that's not dissuading you from taking any action, at least on this level of thing.
Okay. Yeah. No. Thanks for the comment. That's fair. I definitely agree, and I think that we are aware that is the issue. That is an issue at this time, and that there is that differentiation between the signal that's being sent to UDCs and then ultimately how the retail rate structure aligns with that. And it's not just only an issue related to the TD interface, point of measurement question that we have discussed, previously. It's also, it will, have any impact, even if we just kept the volumetric. There's still that discrepancy, or that I guess the difference between how we do it at the wholesale level for the transmission charge, and then how that's passed through the ultimate end-use customers. So, but that's a fair description, and yes, we are continuing on this and think it is appropriate, even though there might not be a particular, close alignment in some cases with certain retail rate structures. And I just saw a note online that we have some questions, so I'll go to the phones, but after that, after we go back to Jan real quick for another comment. Yeah, do you have one still, Jan?
Yes.
Okay,
so
go ahead.
I understand, the 12CP, the benefits, it addresses the benefits that customers receive throughout the year. I get that. I understand the point about that reduces the volatility. I get that too. The one thing I just want to point out is on cost causation side. So to me, you look at this in two different lenses, if you will. There's the benefit side, there's the cost causation side. But now, those two aren't exactly symmetric. Mm-hmm. On the cost causation side, my understanding is that the majority of the projects that the ISO reviews and approves in its annual transmission planning process are approved on the basis of analysis, which actually uses NCP, non-coincident peaks. In other words, they look at the peak area for PG&E, the peak for PG&E, the peak for Edison, peak for San Diego area, maybe some further refinement of that, like along the coast of PG&E's area, there may be some refinement. But by and large, the cost drivers are the non-coincident peaks in the service areas. I think there's, frankly, a basis here to reconsider the use of CP rather than instead of NCP. We're going to be talking about this internally to our company to see if we want to push this point further, but I do think that there is a pretty strong basis for actually using NCP rather than CP. One other point is that the Energy Commission forecast, for example, that the ISO uses in its studies are all NCP peak demand forecasts. They forecast the peak for each service area. So just another point that I think NCP has a valid role to play here, and we're going to think about it internally and see whether this is worth pushing further. But
okay,
I just want to make that point.
Thanks for the comments, Jan. We appreciate the discussion on the NCP versus coincident peak. And I guess I think I'll take a stab at giving you a response now. And it's not to say that the ISO doesn't utilize NCP for some of its analysis. I certainly agree with that point. I believe that for the system-wide planning purposes, we do utilize the system-wide coincident peak, though. And then there's also some nuance there as far as the local areas go. And so planning in certain PTO areas is done a non-coincident peak basis, especially for those local pockets that we have issues with. And I do want to note again that related to this discussion, we are talking about the high voltage transmission here only and not the low voltage transmission. So that may be perhaps even more appropriate to talk about for the low voltage stuff, especially in some of those local areas that do utilize the non-coincident peak as more the driver for some of those reliability projects. But in addition to that, I think that on the system-wide basis, the ISO does utilize, the coincident peak for that planning. Most of the projects are based off of that, but also on top of that, there is those non-peaking periods that we have to also look at too, like the shoulder periods and off-peak timeframes that do drive a lot of the other reliability projects. So there is some, discrepancy between cost causation on like a 1 CP versus 4 CP and 12 CP approaches, and then at the end of that, looking at how the actual system is utilized. Those things all don't line up. So we think that, while there is some issues there and it is fair to raise some of these concerns, we think that ultimately it's still appropriate to utilize the 12 CP approach.
Just a quick follow-up. You said that the ISO actually, for system planning purposes, uses the CP, the coincident peak. So do I gather from that comment the ISO actually goes through an exercise where they actually take the Energy Commission's NCPs and then somehow create an hourly load shape, and then from that derive what the system CP peak is for planning purposes?
I think that's accurate. I'm not going to say that I'm 100% sure on that, though. I would like to have our planning folks in the room to be able to discuss that. They're not here right now at the moment, but so I don't want to say I'm 100% sure on that. But I believe that It's either that the ISO develops it or the CEC also has a coincident peak forecast as well. And I think that it's derived from the CEC forecast ultimately. However we end up getting to it, there is a coincident peak forecast that is utilized for most of that.
I would be interested in knowing a little more detail on that because I wasn't really aware that was being done.
Yeah.
It's all based on NCP.
Let me take that back and talk to our planning folks as well, and I can get back to you on that issue, but that's a fair comment. Also, we hope that you guys will have a robust discussion internally and then come along with our 12CP proposal. Okay, go ahead, Doug. Oh, wait, sorry, before you go, let's go to the phone, and Kanya, I think, is on the phone because she's been in the queue for a while and wants to give a comment. So let's go to the phone real quick. Operator, if you could open up, I think it's Kanya from ORA.
Caller, your line has been unmuted. Please state your name and your question.
Good morning. It is Kanya Dorland with the Public Advocate's Office. We changed our name. I wanted to ask...
Oh, sorry. Yes, thank you.
Yes. I wanted to ask if you'll get into more detail on the peak hour period that you're going to use, because we noticed that the peak period varies throughout the year. That is that the peak period is later in the winter, and there's a wider spread of peak hour period between April and October. Also because the TPP discussion last Friday mentioned that the peak hour is becoming later in the day because of the drop-off of solar power.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. So, I think that mirrors some of the comments that were provided in the written feedback from the Public Advocate's Office. So, the ISO believes that there is not really any negative issues associated with utilizing the hourly peak over the month for the system-wide coincident peak, and it, as long as we're capturing what the contributions for each of the UDC PTO areas are to that monthly coincident peak, it really doesn't matter if it happens at 9 a.m. or 9 p.m. or, whenever that actually takes place, and the ISO identifies that monthly peak, a monthly system-wide peak, that's when we would apply this cost allocation to that period. And so that's really the basis for that response on the issue of, that it may shift during different periods. And we think that is, of course, that's accurate, and that's appropriate and okay to have happen for this rate-making purposes. And then as far as, having a longer period where it may be, let's say, a flatter peak where there's close to the same peak during different hours, like, let's just say, for instance, during February, on whatever that day of the month that's the peak is, and then, over the period from 6, 7, 8, 9 p.m., those are all very flat and almost, the same monthly peak. Well, that really doesn't have an impact on the overall rate making or the overall allocation of costs, as long as we're ensuring that the right amount of cost is going to be allocated to that coincident peak demand bucket of the TRR cost, and then the rate developed on that hourly basis is applied, across the overall system to all the entities. So that's really where we are in response to that question and comment from the Public Advocates, Kanya. So I hope that helps respond to your issue, but I'm happy to take any more clarification.
Yeah, I just want to confirm what you're saying is that because you're going to use the historic data, it isn't going to be, you aren't going to say like 6 p.m. is the peak hour throughout the year. The peak hour is going to move.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Exactly. So even though we may have set the rate based off of, let's say, a February peak of, hour ending 19, and then the next year we saw that actual February peak be hour ending 21 or hour ending 16 or whenever that ends up being, the resulting rate from that historic data isn't going to be that far off from the actual rate that would have resulted from perhaps that different actual observation throughout the year. So yeah, so exactly what you said is right. That's the reason why we're thinking that it's okay, because we're not just going to say it's during these exact hours. We're just basing the setting of the rate off of the annualized historic data. And then once we actually observe those peaks and apply it, it will still be based off of those monthly peaks that we actually observe, and those can change and shift throughout the year.
And will it be more than 1 hour in some cases, or only, you know?
No, so that's the structure. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying, it will be more than 1 hour?
Yeah, so it will not be more than 1 hour because of the way that we develop the rate itself, and that's based off of doing 12 hourly measurements throughout the year. So if we were to apply it to more than 1 hour, then we would over-collect the amount of overall revenue that we were supposed to collect for the demand charge component of the TRR. So that's why we would only do it on 1 hour. And so even though, so like let me just kind of explain a hypothetical I think that you're trying to get at. So like in my example, let's say in April, in that coincident peak day, you know, hour ending 17 through 20 is all very consistent and almost the same peak load. And then, you know, let's say hour ending 19 peaks at, you know, 10 megawatts higher than those other hours. Well, you know, some could say that that's fair, that we should try to, you know, allocate peak costs across all that whole peak for that day. But if you know, you can't really do that after the fact. Once you set the 12 CP rate, it's really only appropriate to apply that to the 1 peak hour. And we still think that that will, you know, strike an appropriate balance where we have a fair amount of cost allocation based on peak load, you know, drivers and benefits that are being delivered on that peak hour. Even though obviously, of course, benefits will be delivered throughout those, you know, peak hours over that whole day, and you know, across the whole year, of course. So it's kind of a balance that we're trying to strike here with you know, doing a volumetric component to capture the energy use, and then the 12 CP to capture the monthly peaks. And when those do, you know, have a lower, flatter, I guess, load profile throughout a day. You know, we understand where you guys are coming from with the comment, but we think that you know, it would be overly complex to build a rate structure that tries to forecast or account for that sort of thing, because different things can happen with historic data versus the forecast and that sort of thing. Does that help, Connie?
Yeah, no, it explains how you're going to do it. Thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, let's keep going. Oh, wait, sorry, Doug, do you still, yeah, you have another comment? Go ahead.
Yeah, fine. Getting to the, Jen's point about the NCP versus the 12 CP, I think one of the things that's underlying your philosophy here, that, if you can correct me if I'm wrong here, is this notion that, like, while the historic cost drivers, like in the actual transmission planning process, probably have been, you know, various NCP around, this proposal is not trying to allocate all costs based purely on historical cost drivers, because cost allocation incorporates both a historic driver construct and the sort of current beneficiaries, and both of those are ingredients in the pie, if you will. And it seems like the 12 CP is trying to capture some of the historic drivers, but also like reflecting what's going on currently, because the 12 CP, you know, the coincident peak and the NCPs, they're going to be somewhat correlated in time, so that there's sort of a bit of a fudge. And I appreciate the fact that you're using 12, because I think the issue of statistical noise using a single is a real one. So
yeah, actually,
that's kind of underlying how you got at this.
Yeah, and no, and thanks for actually, you know, touching on that again for a couple of reasons. One is, you know, I think that that's right, that we want to, you know, express that more clearly, I guess, a little bit. So let me try to do that. Then also we have one of our planning engineers here in the room as well to help talk about this issue too. So, yeah, so, you know, it's a fair point that Jan makes about the non-coincident peak really being a driver for some of the transmission planning processes and, you know, a cost driver in itself, of course. But yes, that is a good point, Doug, and that's really where the ISO is coming from in trying to see, you know, how much do the benefits really get spread across the system based on the coincident peak usage, and that's really where we're trying to, you know, say that the 12 CP approach and utilizing coincident peak really, it may not line perfectly with the cost causation, admittedly, but we think that ultimately, in the end, the way that it actually allocates cost, looking at who are really benefiting and what areas are driving those coincident peaks will be better off for the system, for the rate design, so that in the future, as we plan the system, the folks will see that there's a need to reduce the peak load, each month, even if it is during a month where there's, a lot of behind the meter production and things like that, where there might not be a large stress on the system, but there's still going to be those hourly periods throughout the month where there is a peak period that's coincident with the system, where everyone's, using the system a lot. And so we think that, the idea of the UDC areas that may not have as high of a load factor would be reflected better by using coincident peak than rather using non-coincident peak load. So that is something to consider a little bit further in the discussions. But I do want to pose the question, because we have Catalin here in the room, and maybe if you wanted to touch on that again, Jan, about the coincident peak use and the non-coincident peak use in the transmission planning, now that we actually have someone who might be able to speak to it a little bit thoroughly than me.
I always lose when I talk with Catalin.
That's why we got him in here, to help me out, yeah. We're bringing in the big guns for this one.
Well, no, I guess, Catalin, what I was saying earlier was that my understanding of the basic transmission planning approach the ISO uses to identify upgrades is to use the Energy Commission's forecast peak demand for each independent service area, San Diego's, PG&E's, Edison's, with some variation for like coastal zones and stuff like that. But by and large, it's the Energy Commission's peak forecast that drives a lot of the planning decisions. And so what I was saying was that's a non-coincident peak. And so at least from a cost causation standpoint, that would be a viable basis for allocating the peak component of the transmission charge. So the question to you, and then
I was basically following up on that and saying, well, we do have local areas that are based on those PTO non-coincident peaks, and that, local reliability projects are commonly, justified through that, but also the ISO does use a coincident peak forecast for the system-wide planning purposes. And so I just wanted to clarify that and make sure that was accurate, and that I wasn't just, making something up here in front of everybody. but to be honest, that was something that I wasn't 100% sure on. So, how would you describe how we do the planning for the local with the non-coincident peak versus the system-wide, overall system peak that we look at?
Yeah, hi everybody, this is Catalin. So I can speak to that. I can't say that I'm totally up to speed on exactly how TAC changes are proposed to be made, but I can explain how planning is done. So basically the high voltage, there is a differentiation now between the NERC definition, right, and what the TAC definition used to be. The TAC definition is like everything that's above 200 kV. Well, now on NERC, everything that's above 100 kV, it's like high voltage, and only.
So for this discussion,
For this discussion, I use the 200. So in planning world, we actually don't differentiate by 200 or less than 200. So we do planning for local areas versus system. And the local areas are planned on whenever that local area peaks and all the loads are coincident with that peak. So if you're thinking about the system, it's not a system coincident peak. It's whenever that local area peaks. And then whatever the transmission is required to meet reliability standards, it is done on, the best approach, best technical approach to the problem. My idea, a 115 kV problem that is solved by a new 230 kV line. Okay, but it could be a 230 kV problem that might be solved by one single 115 kV line. So we don't actually go into those details rather than coming up with what is the best technical and economic solution among the alternatives. So that's how planning is done. So what I'm trying to tell you is that they're not perfect alignment between what you're trying to accomplish with how planning is done.
But is it fair to say that nowhere in that process you actually take the Energy Commission's peak demand forecast for each of the IOU service areas, and then somehow from that create a single coincident peak demand forecast for the ISO balancing authority area and use that number?
So for the most part, we do have the local planning areas, which some of them coincide with the CEC forecast, some of them don't. So we actually get the PTOs and ourselves to make some local coincident factors for some local areas, especially in PG&E. For San Diego specifically, we get one from the CEC. Right. We respect that because it's kind of a small and one piece together. But some other areas are so wide spread out where the CEC gives us kind of a TAC-wide load forecast, but they don't give us a Humboldt forecast because that one is in January and it's not when the system peaks, and so we have to make one up. And even the other local areas within PG&E, they don't peak when we have to come up with when those peak. It could be a different day, different hour, totally different. And then whatever the transmission comes out of that, it's just the best technical overall available transmission to meet that. Do we actually make a system-wide one ISO case? We make one like that, but it's not, usually doesn't drive anything, because once you fix your local area problems with 1 in 10, we go to the next level, which is more like we call it a system case, but it's not really ISO system. It's more like we have one for the northern area and one for the south. We have a Southern California case and a Northern California case. Those are usually done more like a 1 in 5 forecast. So if anything comes out of that case, we can also justify a transmission project. And then we can go to the ISO case, but by the time you end up with an ISO case, usually nothing new pops up that didn't pop up before in all the other cases stacked up to that particular case.
So I think I'm vindicated.
Well, I would just say I think that's a fair point and something to think about. But remember that FERC precedent has been very clear that any type of high voltage transmission above 200 kV is very much helping provide benefits across a wide footprint, and that is really the basis for why we have this socialized TAC, for the HV TAC versus the low voltage TAC, which is more driven by those the non-coincident peaks of those TAC areas. So fair point, Jan, and point well taken, and I'm glad that we actually got to clarify that. So okay, I'm going to go to Doug and then over to Paul after that.
Beat you by a quick second with the hand raised. That's great points about the way, and thank you for providing the insight into how the planning works, because that is informative. But I did want to kind of emphasize, because I know when we talk about cost causation, it's important to realize that in, at least as FERC uses that term, it's not purely the historic cost drivers, but it is, as you were saying, it's also the beneficiaries. There's two components to cost causation. And because to kind of, if we were to pursue kind of Jan's logic a little bit further, if we're really looking at what's driving the existing transmission system to be built the way it is, we wouldn't look at the NCP today. What we'd really do is go back through all of the transmission planning documents back to, ideally back to 1980 or whenever, and look at what was the NCP when this was built. That's the actual historical cost driver. I don't think anybody wants to do that, right? So even if we were to use today's NCPs or regional peaks, we're still looking at what's going on today, not which isn't going to be a perfect alignment with what actually drove the system to be built by the decision makers back in the day. So I think it's useful to realize that whatever we come up with, it's only got this loose linkage to what the actual historical cost drivers were. And I completely think and agree that's the way we should do it. We should think about how are people using it today? That's how we fairly divvy up the costs. So.
Yeah, and that goes all the way back to the points we made at the beginning of the principles that we were trying to align with, and it's easy just to say those things, and when you actually dive into it a little bit more and talk about it like what you've done, Doug, that is kind of where we find ourselves, with our position on this whole proposal is it is related to that. So that's thank you for raising that again. I think that's fair, and that I think I would agree that if you really to try to figure out what exactly was the pure cost driver, and that was the only way you wanted to set the rates, we would have a totally different overall structure than this, and we would try to do things more along that line where we were identifying exactly the cost drivers purely, and that was how we would allocate the cost. But since we're trying to blend some of these things, it isn't really a pure science, like you said. And we did try to, we did try to do that where we looked at the historic drivers of the system for trying to do the bifurcation of the TRR, and that was quite a frustrating endeavor, to be honest. I mean, trying to figure out what the cost drivers are of historic projects. I mean, of course, we have a lot of documentation about what the needs are, but it's really not allocated, or it's not really showing how that need is allocated amongst different parties. It's really just how does the overall system need drive those new, infrastructure assets. So, with that in mind, I think it is fair to continue down this path of using a 12 CP approach, even though it might not be a perfect alignment with the way that the system was totally planned, but, for some of these other reasons that we noted as well. Beyond that. So there's, a balance to be struck there again. But let's keep going. And we got Paul, one more comment from Paul, and then I'll check on the phone before we keep moving along.
This is Paul Nelson with CLECA. I know this is a very useful discussion, kind of understanding a little bit better and addressing Jan's, comments and concerns. I'm going to have to think about this one a bit more because I think you mentioned what, Humboldt peaks in January, and I'm trying to figure out if you're going to use a non-coincident peak. I mean, what are you trying to achieve with this and get the cost, in terms of cost recovery and allocation, in the context that we have with in the CAISO. This is a very, very tricky one. I think I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, no, that's fair. John, you want to add anything?
This is John Gooden. I think that this all holds together. And Doug, I think your point is a good one because, again, if you go back in time and what drove some of these decisions from like Catalin's group where you're starting at the lowest level, the local, and then doing the north and south in certain areas and identifying those needs. And then ultimately, if you still have some needs at the system level, like Catalin says, it's rare that you actually get to that because generally you've solved your problems as you've moved up from local to regional to system, essentially is the way that I think about it. But I think that it all holds together for the point you make that ultimately when you're talking about the TRR and doing some of that cost allocation is that it all kind of gets thrown into the soup, all these costs for these planning upgrades, transmission upgrades, investments that you made, all kind of get thrown into that TRR soup at the end of the day. And so what you're trying to do is ultimately allocate those costs appropriately rather than your point where, okay, then you'd have to go back, every year, step back and look at the specific, cause, and that would just be unworkable. So this, I think, is, you're talking a bit about the apples and oranges between the planning and how we're actually going to recover and drive the proper incentives on. Once all those costs get into that soup, if you will, how do we drive the right incentives and behaviors?
Yeah, and I think really the idea of how we want to, sorry, this is Chris again, how we want to capture the benefits that are being delivered and provided to users on a monthly basis is really the primary driver for this 12CP. So, of course, the whole structure and everything that we've been talking about, we are trying to, again, relate both cost causation and the benefits that are being provided as well as we can, but there's obviously some balance that needs to be, struck there and have, there be some necessary, departure from some of these things because there's no way that you can get it perfect on all the aspects of this, trying to reflect both those things. It is, as we noted, in our principles, it is, sometimes these things differ from the cost drivers and who's benefiting now today, and that's been something that Doug has brought up frequently in his comments, and so we are trying to balance that need, and it's not fair to charge just purely on cost causation. It's probably not fair to charge just purely on benefits that are being received right now, and that's why we think we're trying to align both of those. So with that, I thought that was a pretty good, helpful discussion from everyone and for planning to clarify that stuff. So thanks for everybody's input on that piece. But the ISO does still strongly believe that the 12CP approach is appropriate. let's keep going on. Oh, Paul, want to follow up on that? Sure.
Yeah, you know, you were discussing a lot of cost causation. It's certainly and definitely important in the whole thing of getting, you know, trying to come up with what's considered a, you know, a fair and reasonable cost recovery and allocation. But there's also the issue of, you know, the benefits. And, you know, even resolving some of these local constraint areas can result in benefits outside that local area. And the planning guy just left. That was kind of what I wanted to kind of get his reaction on that.
Well, yeah, let's just be honest. I mean, you know, the way that we allocate costs for capacity in TAC areas is not just based off of those individual local pockets. It's based off of the overall TAC area. And beyond that, it's really having one local area be unreliable in the system could bring down whole chunks of the system as well. So that is very important. There is benefits that are provided by making sure that reliability is maintained in local areas as well. So I'm going to go over here, David, and then John wants to make clarification as well.
Complicate matters even more. This is David Oliver now again. A more frequent concern in reliability studies is low voltage situations where the load is actually very low, and so actually quite actually more, and this is in high voltage transmission, more solutions and mitigations for low voltage, low load situations.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, there's often times where we see, you know, certain facilities that are farther out in the system that are not local areas, but they do need, you know, high voltage reinforcement because of low voltage issues or, you know, reactive power issues in certain areas, things like that. And, you know, that kind of more aligns with the energy usage of the system piece of it and the volumetric component. And so that's why we think, you know, that does, we're not saying we should only just do a peak demand charge because of issues like that. And so that's a good point as well. John, did you want to make any clarification?
Yeah, John Gooden, ISO. Just on Paul's comment, I think the analogy, Paul, is like on resource adequacy where you have local capacity can count towards system because even though it's located locally, it is addressing some of your system needs, the energy provided by those resources. And I think the same analogy on the transmission and really drives to Catalin's point that your local problems that you're solving, moving up to regional problems that you're solving, all these sort of add to address ultimately what could be system problems. And essentially you're addressing some of those issues starting at the lowest level, local, regional, and then you may not even have any more problems once you've addressed those at those levels for the system.
All right. Thanks, John. Any follow-up questions? There's another comment on the phone. If you could open up the lines, operator.
Good morning. This is Kanya Dorland with the Public Advocate's Office. Again, I wanted to also note that, you know, with this proposal, there are still some issues with PTOs that are going to be able to avoid the peak demand charge because they peak differently than the system. And I understand what you're saying that, you know, the high voltage transmission provides benefits to everyone and they will still pay for their volumetric, but when we looked at the actual numbers, it really looked like, you know, VEA, for example, is going to benefit more from this proposal by paying less for their transmission.
Yeah, so let me just kind of give a brief overview of the idea of like the socialization of this, you know, license plate rate structure that we have here in California where there is necessarily a socialization of some of the high voltage costs. Again, that aligns, you know, going back to when this was approved, where, you know, there is benefits that are delivered to the overall system and broad ranging, you know, far reaching benefits from 200 kV type facilities and above. And your point, you know, kind of is well taken that, of course, there's going to be some UDC areas that are charged less under this proposal than what they would be if they just kept the volumetric approach. And so, you know, we actually don't really believe that is an area where they're, you know, shifting costs inappropriately, though. That is actually a reflection of the true benefits and costs that are being driven by those areas. So for that VEA example, if they have a low coincident peak, they're actually driving a low amount of cost during that period and should be allocated a lower proportion compared to some other areas. And then on top of that, I think that, the ultimate analysis that we provided, as we'll talk about a little bit later, the numbers are all really based off of the current load conditions, historic settlement data, and then we actually had to do some load profiling techniques to kind of, avoid revealing some of those, confidential issues. So confidential load data of some of the entities. And so, while we wanted to try to provide as much insight into the potential impacts as we could, we do believe that there's, obviously, we tried to highly caveat that analysis and say that, the ultimate allocation of this is going to really depend on, each individual UDC area's peak loads during those coincident peak periods, and that could shift drastically depending on the day, depending on the month, depending on the overall usage based on the other entities, because if an area is not really driving the peak and they're just, being allocated costs based off of that, we're actually thinking that that's more aligned with how much they're actually benefiting from using the system during that period. So we think it's appropriate to actually charge them less in those situations if they aren't really receiving as much benefit as another area that may be having a higher peak during the coincident peak period. So, that is actually the intent of the proposal. We don't think that's a problem with the proposal, in our opinion.
We've made this recommendation before, but having, 6 coincident peak might be a way to have them, an entity like VEA pay for their benefits of transmission, but going forward having, peak be a component of the rate recovery based on who's using the system, in the evening. It seems that VEA peaks in the morning, and that's how they would avoid a peak demand charge. But if you choose 6 CP, then they potentially would continue to pay about what they're paying now.
Sure. So, that may be appropriate outcome, but ultimately that would just mean we would collect twice as much revenue for each monthly coincident peak period. And so, that could change, that could shift from year to year, and we don't really know what's ultimately going to happen. So while your point's well taken, I think we still believe that the 12 CP approach is appropriate for this frequency, just because, for some of those other reasons we described, and honestly, it doesn't seem to be an issue where certain entities that pay more now would pay less because of this. That is something that, a number of stakeholders have raised, and the ISO is trying to clarify that we agree with that point, and we accept that is the case. That will happen and necessarily be an outcome of this proposal. But we think that kind of cost impact is justified and reasonable, and that's why we're continuing to propose it. And so, just because an entity is going to pay less under this, or an entity would pay more under this proposal, doesn't mean that the proposal is unjust or unreasonable at all. And we believe that is appropriate to continue down this proposal, this path to implement this proposal because of that. And on top of that, I think I would just add that we don't really ultimately know what would happen. And going back to that overall socialization aspect of this, if you look at how much the certain PTOs are contributing to the overall TRR versus how much they ultimately have to pay, there's some wide range of that, depending on the certain area. And so it's not really fair just to point out one entity would get a increase in cost over another in this situation. It's really going to depend on how much they contribute to those monthly peaks, monthly coincident peaks, and there are going to be some that pay less for this component of it, but I think it does strike a balance to still maintain part of this structure being a volumetric approach as well, so that way that does capture the overall gross load usage as well as the coincident peak component of it. And so that's why we think it's still appropriate to go forward with this proposal.
I understand what
We
you're
got
saying.
another question in the room. Go ahead.
I was just going to add, are you going to reevaluate this proposal, after the 2 years, after 2 or 3 years, are you going to evaluate whether it is just and reasonable? Whether people are paying for their benefits?
We have no proposal within the proposed modifications to revisit the way that the allocation is being resulting from this proposal. So I would say that there isn't a specific proposal to reevaluate how the outcomes actually are aligned with the rates themselves that are resulting from this. But of course, the ISO is always reviewing its proposals and reviewing its ultimate cost allocation for issues, and there will be very clear data how much. Got a lot of feedback here. Okay, folks will actually be able to see how much the individual areas were contributing to those historical peaks once we actually are setting the rates for those areas. So, if that number varies drastically from year to year, you'll be able to see that afterwards. And so I don't think the ISO is really going to be providing specific analysis based off of this, but if there are anomalies and issues that are coming up because of the way that we've developed this proposal, obviously the ISO would be keen to recognize those and address them if needed. But again, I think we are of the opinion here at the ISO that this proposal will result in appropriate rates and not be too overly volatile. Any follow-up?
Yeah, I would just say it would be great to have a commitment to look at it, in 3 years. Are there any anomalies that could be addressed?
Okay. Well, we'll expect that. We'll expect that in your written comments, and we'll take that under advisement. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. I'm gonna go to Doug here in the room.
Yeah. No, thanks so much, and thank you, Kanye, for that question. I think that gives good food for thought in terms of the treatment of areas that may have locally very different peaks. And I guess there's a question maybe was it Catlin a bit. So if you were to compare the case of let's look at say Humboldt just hypothetically, that has they have their local peak. The local area system is designed for that, and so that gets built even though their peak is not coincident with the system. But my sense is, and this is I guess where a question for people who know more about this than I do, is that because their peak isn't coincident with everybody else's peak, when you get up to the regional or the system level, they don't end up triggering regional or system level additional transmission above and beyond their local, right? I'm seeing some nodding in the room. Excellent. So in a certain sense, I guess again goes to Chris's point that, yeah, I think this does sound just and reasonable in the sense that because their peak is not coincident, that's fair that there's kind of a bit of a break there because that peak isn't contributing to, one, it's not contributing to regional and system projects, and they're not getting as much benefit from regional and system projects because they're essentially using capacity that's going to get built to serve other people's needs anyway. So they're kind of like, they're driving when we're not in rush hour. And
exactly.
So that's good because,
yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank
you for.
I think I've thought that through then.
Thank you for that, Doug. So yeah, so that's a better way of saying what I was trying to say, which is if you use let's just say it's like I know I hate you guys know I hate the analogies about the highway system, but I'll use one right now. So let's just say it's it's basically like using the HOV lane on the weekend when it's open and free for everybody, right? There isn't a lot of traffic during that time frame, and so there isn't really a toll for going during that time frame, which is a similar type of situation or analogy to this, where there may be a smaller PTO area that peaks during the morning and doesn't actually have as great of a peak load during the coincident peak period, and so they aren't charged as as much as they would if we were to utilize a non-coincident peak. But this also does go back to kind of the comment from SDG&E as well about what what are we really trying to capture here? What is the most appropriate way to design this rate? And so thank you for that example though, Doug. I think that's right, and that's really what we're intending here. David, go ahead.
Just so we're clear, Humboldt isn't a PTO. PG&E would be the one whether they're peaking with everybody else or not peaking. These local areas don't have their own TAC revenue.
That's right. No. Yeah.
So, we're talking about maybe smaller PTOs, just to be clear. So even if you have a region within PG&E that peaks separately, like the coast probably separately from the inland or whatever, the valley area, that's not going to really affect those different areas within PG&E, for example. So
that's right. And just for also remember, too, that I think, when we're talking about local issues, Catalin did mention that there is, obviously, we look for the best solution, and that doesn't matter what voltage level we're talking about. But I would just state that, most of the local area type solutions are going to be in that low voltage TAC type of cost recovery because they'll be lower than 200 kV. So that does lead me to say it is more appropriate to utilize the coincident peak. This purpose is for the high voltage system because of that, overall broader benefit that's delivered across a broader geographic region, and all those costs contributing more to on the coincident peak and the benefits as well, all following along in that line. So, follow up, Doug?
Yeah, just very quickly. Point out also because of this nested structure of looking at local needs and then regional needs and system needs, would point out that all of the distribution level effects on load, EE, in front of the meter DG, behind the meter DG, all that stuff, supplying voltage support from advanced inverters from local resources. Because all of that contributes to meeting local needs, if those benefits flow up throughout, at the regional, at the system level. So if you need stuff at the distribution level, you kind of get 3 bangs for your buck, roughly speaking. Not sure how it.
Yeah, well, and that's fair. I wouldn't disagree with that. I just think that the magnitude of the impact of those will be smaller as you move up the chain to the higher voltage stuff. But of course, in whole, as you add up all of those impacts at a lower level, they will, flow up through to the transmission system as well. Certainly, we agree with that. Okay. Where are we at here? We're on page 15 of the slides. Let's get into this stuff before lunch. I think we can probably try to work through most of this stuff before noon. So let's talk a little bit about the bifurcation of the TRR. I think we spent a pretty good amount of time on all of that discussion about coincident peak versus non-coincident peak and historic versus forecast for setting the rates. So, let's get into this stuff. This is how you actually are going to ultimately set the rates. This is the first step in that, essentially, is we're going to have to bifurcate the TRR under this hybrid proposal because we need to figure out how much of that amount of the TRR will be collected under the volumetric approach and how much will be collected under the peak demand rate. So the ISO is proposing to use a system load factor calculation. And again, the change to this one is that we would utilize the historical data to do this. We were going to use forecasted data to align with the rate setting process, but since we're changing the proposal to do historic, we believe that that's appropriate to do for this as well, and that aligns with the examples that we included in the proposal itself, which I put up here on the slide as well for folks, so you can kind of just get a sense of how this calculation would pan out if we were to have applied it to the previous, 6 years or so here of coincident peak data that we have. And so, essentially the calculation is listed in the proposal, but it's really, you're looking at the driver is really the annual coincident peak load here in the second column on the top of the table, and then the annual gross load, overall gross load. And you do the calculation to figure out what the load factor would be, and if you apply that load factor to the historic TRR proportions, you would get something along the line percentage splits down here in the bottom of this proposal, which are all pretty consistent and pegged right around the 45 to 55% range. Actually, even a little bit closer than that, 46 to 54. So, we think that that's a better approach than perhaps some of the other things we considered, and it's based on easily available data and can be reviewed easily by stakeholders. Have a transparent way to set the rates. So how will we actually implement this? Again, we'll do this calculation annually at the beginning of the rate period for that annual year. And then once we do that, we won't update it throughout the year. So it'll be still, if we set the split at 55% volumetric, 45% demand charge, that will stay consistent throughout that whole time period. And again, we're going to utilize historic data, but specifically, I believe it was the 6 cities that provided this feedback. What we agreed with would be to utilize the period from October 1st through September 30th of the prior annual period, so that way we aren't running into any issues with time lag for the availability of the data and how we actually set these rates. So that made sense to us. It's similarly aligned with how the TRBA mechanism works, where they look at the period October 1st through September 30th. And this will also be how we set the actual demand charge rate itself as well for that same period. So those are all aligned. Doug, go ahead.
Just a nerdy question. Did you all think about doing multiple years, aggregating multiple years into that?
Yeah, so for this purpose of the TRR bifurcation piece, we were not thinking that we would need to do that because we wanted to actually not smooth out those variations. So let's say, let's go back to this, example. And if you look, at some of these periods, as you can see, the driver here for this, 49,900 peak we had in September of last year drives the TRR proportion up for the peak demand. And that's what we want to happen appropriately, exactly. And so as you'll see a little bit later as we go through this, there is some more analysis about, using rolling averages that was suggested by PG&E to do historic analysis if we were going to propose that. And that's what we provided, hoping to, provide some justification for why we thought that we shouldn't use a rolling average type approach. But, if we were to have changed the proposal to do that, I think it would be more appropriate to do that here as well. But since we're kind of trying to keep those things all aligned, that's why we're not proposing to do a longer time period for this load factor calculation. All right. Okay, we went over this slide period. It's October 1st through September 30th. So let's talk about the actual rate formula itself. So this one hasn't been changed from the prior iteration, should be well established, and everyone hopefully understands it at this point. This is just a listing of the 3 major steps of how we would actually ultimately set the rate for implementation. So step 1 splits the TRR under the system-wide gross load factor calculation that we have explained in the proposal in more depth. And then step 2 is developing the volumetric rate, where we utilize that volumetric proportion of the TRR and determine what the volumetric rate per megawatt hour would be. And that, again, would be based off of the forecasted gross loads. And then step 3 is the final step in setting the rates, which would be to determine the 12 CP demand rate, which to do that, we just take the portion of the TRR for the demand charge component and then divide that by the overall annualized 12 CP demand that we glean from that historic information. So that's the steps, just a description of how we do them. This next slide here is just an example. This has been in the proposal as well, hasn't been changed, but utilizing the 2017 data. So this is how we would do it, just in including some numbers here so that folks can actually see what the resulting rates may look like. Just based on that historic data from 2017 and those rates and TRR numbers that we would come up with through this new approach. So looks a lot like what we do today. It's not meant to be a huge change, but just the addition of this 12 CP demand charge component here. So this is just an explanation of how we'd actually design the rate based on, our normal posted rate worksheets that we have up on our website under our settlements page, and when you go under the high voltage TAC rates, so you can take a look at that. But this is basically, how it is today with this volumetric component here. And you can see it's, based on the filed gross load and that figure here. And then if you look at the addition of this 12CP one, so this is a similar type of approach to this previous slide with the volumetric TAC rate development, but for this one it's just the annualized 12CP demand. And, again, that's from the historic settlement data here that we would utilize, so you can see that the resulting rate that would come out of that. And then the HV utility-specific demand rates and volumetric rates that are on these two components here illustrate how we actually have to implement the monthly allocation process, where we look at how much we would collect under those versus how much we collect under the overall system-wide rate. And that process, I'll talk a little bit about that more in the following slides. Okay, so hopefully these are pretty straightforward for everyone. But again, if you have any questions, please let us know about how we actually set the rates. We talk a little bit more in depth in the actual proposal itself. So let's talk about what kind of data we would utilize in this historic issue and, explain it a little bit further. So for setting the demand charge, we talked about this as a change to the proposal. This is probably the primary largest change here that we want to talk about with stakeholders. We, at the ISO, proposed two other options previously. First, we were saying, well, let's just use the CEC IPR forecast to do this, because we could get hourly peak demands from that eventually at some point. At least that was the initial thinking. And even though we may be able to glean that data, it might not actually align with the rate cases and the forecast that PTOs themselves might make. So that one seemed to not really make sense after we thought through it a little bit further. Some significant pushback from stakeholders there on that one. And then similarly with using PTO for rate case forecast data, we got some good support from the IOUs here. We appreciated that thought and consideration from folks, and then we got a lot of pushback from some of the smaller PTOs, and also, some of the entities that don't go in and update their rate cases as often, and saying that this would be probably problematic to try to do this iterative process that we had in mind in the previous proposal. When we talked with folks, there was a lot of suggestions to utilize historic data. And so, with that, we ultimately decided that, these issues would be probably too burdensome to try to develop this forecasted approach. And when you look at some of this historic analysis that we've done, it doesn't really show a really wide variance from year to year, which is another one of the reasons why we think it's all right and appropriate to utilize this historic data. So let's talk about exactly how we'll implement this. So again, we talk about this October 1st through September 30th timeframe, that we would utilize for the splitting the bifurcation of the TRR as well. I just wanted to provide this slide because it provides an example of exactly how this would be implemented, so it's really clear. And I want to talk about that, and it's the second sub-bullet here explaining, if you're going to use this October 1 through September 30th period, let's say we're setting the TAC rates for the 2021 year, then the actual date would be October 1st, 2019 through September 30th, 2020, would set the rates for the following annual period. So that's the intent there to explain how this would actually be implemented. And we believe that, using this does continue to be aligned with the way that we would do the HV TRR bifurcation with that system load factor calculation, also based on historic data. Okay, so now we get into a little bit more of this analysis piece. Some stakeholders, as mentioned, said, hey, we don't really oppose the use of historic data, but at least show us some numbers here to provide some sense of if this is going to be problematic, or if there would be some major impacts that are unseen at this point, and that might cause some concern. And so we wanted to try to provide that to the extent possible, utilizing our historic data that we have, public data that's available. So what we believe is that the 1 year period is reasonable and that there's relatively low variance from year to year when comparing individual years over the past 4 years or 5 years, and then the actual annualized demand figures if you were to utilize perhaps like a 2-year or 3-year or 4-year rolling average over those time frames. So the other issue is that we think that, if you do things like like averaging over multiple time periods, multiple annual periods, or including weather normalization, then you start to mute that impact of the variations from year to year of how we would actually, see that shift in the components of the TRR being allocated to volumetric versus peak demand. So that was one of the other reasons for, I believe, appropriate to continue with the 1-year period of historic data. So I'll go through this analysis real quick and then stop for questions. So this is the analysis. This is new for this iteration of the proposal. We included in the proposal itself as well, but I pulled these couple slides out just to talk about it with stakeholders here today. So as you can see, for 2014 through 2017, the annualized 12CP demand doesn't vary very much. It's not that different from year to year as you look at that. And then if you do an average over 2, 3, 4 years of those historic periods, again, you're going to get something that's even more consistent, but doesn't vary that much amongst any of these historic observations, really. If you look at the little matrix that we've provided here, you can see that the variation only goes between, -2 and 2% really, maximum for these historic periods, at least, for that kind of variance. If you just compare those pure annualized demand figures for each of those years, and then each of the rolling periods that we did, 2016-17, 2015-17, and 2014-17. So with that, I'll just go over this next slide real quick. This one is comparing the actual resulting rates that would occur if we were to apply the rolling averages or different historic periods compared to the January 2017 rate for the TRR. So let's say we have 50% split. Again, we're just assuming that split number. That'll change based on historic data as well. But if we kept holding that constant, you can see the resulting impact to the rates in this third column here, and then the actual percentage variation between those each period. In the ISO's opinion, is not material, and we think that it's all right to continue to utilize a 1-year period. And when you see things like a 2% or a 3.5% change from year over year, we think that it's appropriate to reflect that in the rate itself. So with that, and then I want to talk about weather normalization again, but we talked a little bit about that already. But I'll pause here and see if there's any comments or questions on this analysis that we provided. Yeah, we do set the rates all the way up to 4 decimals, actually, so that's why I was consistent there. If you look at the TAC rates, we don't round off at only at the fourth, decimal of the cents piece of the rate. We do that actually, and that could actually add up to some significant figures for people that have higher loads. So, but anyhow, really the message here is that we don't see that the variation is going to be enough to warrant doing something different than just the 1-year period. Some of those reasons we explained earlier about, we actually want to see that variation be reflected in the rates is really driver here. So let's continue. Same issue here on this weather normalization piece. So for this slide, we're talking about, the ISO got some suggestions from stakeholders to utilize weather normalization if we were going to do historic data. That's a fair request to think about. We certainly understand stakeholders' input on that. But again, we think that there's no real need to include weather normalization here just because the complexity of doing that related to the actual effects that we see might happen because of it don't really justify including it in the proposal. And then again, we think that the resulting impacts because of weather normalization would actually mute the signal perhaps that we think should be properly applied and you know, may cause less of the TRR component to be allocated to their appropriate area, either volumetric or peak demand. And so that's really the driver here, again, of why we don't think we should be including weather normalization for this historic demand data that we would utilize. Any questions on this stuff? Yeah.
Just a comment on weather normalization and my long experience with that. There's a lot of art in that process in and of itself. So I can see why you'd want to kind of.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, considering where we are at this point in the proposal as well, to try to develop a useful weather normalization, you know, approach that would be accepted by stakeholders, I think was quite more of a challenge than it would be to, you know, accept the resulting variation that will happen by just using non-weather normalized data. So that's a driver there, admittedly. But again, I think we still would agree that, you know, or our position is still that, you know, the impact is relatively low from year to year since we looked at that number. So point well taken, though. All right. Okay, we're just cruising along here. Good. I think we can probably wrap things up before lunch, hopefully, here. Oops. Okay. Let me check the time real quick, though. Oh, we've got 10 more minutes. I don't know. Maybe not. We might have to keep you guys around. But let's just keep going through and see how far we can make it. This issue, this slide just talks about the issue of doing PTO-specific demand rates. So, you know, same thing we talked about at the prior meeting. You know, that was something we overlooked in the initial proposal, where we were thinking, you know, we could utilize the system-wide rate and it wouldn't impact the way we actually did the allocation and the net settlements invoicing process. We could make that workable, but after we talked about it, got stakeholder feedback, we agree we need to have PTO-specific demand rates, similarly to what we have for the volumetric rate today. So again, that goes back to those slides I showed you about how we actually will set the rates and have those PTO-specific rates and then the system-wide rate, and we do the allocation process based on these worksheets I'm going to go through right now as well. And, you know, this part hasn't been changed since the prior proposal either. But again, just to provide an example here of how this net settlements invoicing process works, it really demonstrates how we would apply not only just the volumetric, but this, you know, addition of the peak demand charge to the overall billing determinant, and then how it's actually applied for this net settlements invoicing process. So I just want to walk through these example sheets real quick, and hopefully it should be pretty self-explanatory at this point, and there won't be any questions. But again, happy to answer if there's any confusion here. But this kind of goes back to some of the issues we talked about earlier about the socialization of the TAC and how much you'd actually collect under volumetric and how much you would collect under peak demand and those kind of things. And so you can see this is, again, just the sheet that shows you how to set the volumetric rate. This one on slide 31 here is the sheet that shows how we would set the 12 CP demand rate, again, similar to the other one, but just using slightly different numbers here so it all flows through this example appropriately. And then once we've got these demand and volumetric rates from slide 30 and 31, we would take a look at the actual data for settlements purposes that we would get. And again, the drivers here for these billing determinants are the metered gross load here in column 3, and then the metered peak demand in column 6. Those numbers in column 6 are actually just made up numbers that we didn't, you know, utilize actual values just for this purpose, so have a good example to show folks, because we don't actually have that historic data available. But then again, here's how we actually do the net settlements invoicing. And so really the key here is to show you basically that under the PTO specific rate here, this column 10, the third column from the left here, shows you how much you would collect under the volumetric specific rate. And then the next column over shows you how much you would collect under the actual system-wide rate and how much, you know, you collected in this column 8 on the first part of the slide here. And then at the end, you look at how you'd allocate the difference between those two out to the different PTOs based on their share of load overall. And that's really how we do it for today. This is how it works today with the volumetric process. And what we would do to implement this proposal is just to add this aspect of it, which is the next component and next worksheet that we would be using in the settlements process, which is just the same exact thing as the volumetric one that we do today, but just the addition of using the demand charge and then the actual measured demand for that hour, for that 12 CP hour that we would identify after the fact. So that's how we get through this stuff. This is just an example, again, to show how it would all work and how it would continue to align with the needs for PTOs, rate cases, and then, the current structure that we have in place with the balancing account and the monthly settlements invoicing and that process. So happy to answer any questions about that stuff on these examples, but hopefully it should be pretty self-explanatory. On the phone? Somebody on the phone? Okay, let's go to the phones. Operator, please.
Good morning again. It's Connie Doyle with the Public Advocate's Office. I wanted to go back to the point about VEA and just confirm that when VEA joined the CAISO, their low voltage transmission investments, were they not included in the CAISO's high voltage TRR recovery as a condition of them joining?
Sorry, did you say they were included?
I believe they were. Their system is mostly low voltage, and that's now included in the CAISO's high voltage TRR recovery.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not really familiar with that agreement or how that process worked, but I'm not hearing or seeing any other issues here, but there's someone in the room that wants to make a comment related to this, so I'll turn it over to you, David, real quick, and Tanya will be available for, some more continued discussion.
Yeah, David Oliver at Navigant. So VEA did have some high voltage. They have about, I want to say about 10 million, maybe 20 million. But then they sold it, their high voltage system to GridLiance. You will see GridLiance as a high voltage PTO, I believe, in future, or even
currently. Actually, I think that may be the case. Actually, that's a good point. Sorry, let me just jump in here. This information that we have included right here on these slides that are up right now includes VEA, but you are correct. As you look at the ones that are posted on the website for 2018, they don't include VEA in there anymore. So that there is a little bit of a discrepancy there, but that's the reason why, as you said, those assets were sold to a different PTO. Yeah, so the VEA would still be, I believe, would be allocated costs as part of their, being a UDC, right? But they wouldn't have a TRR amount anymore. It would be that different company and then they would, that GridLiance entity, which probably doesn't have load itself, would be treated similarly to one of these other, entities that doesn't have load, like, Transbay Cable, LLC, and some of these other ones, Citizen Sunrise example, for example. Okay, sorry. So let's get back to Kanya, to your point about the VEA thing. So again, like I said, I don't know for sure if that is, a big concern for this discussion. Also, since it is a relatively, lower proportion of the overall TRR component, I don't want to minimize the fact that there is maybe some low voltage numbers that are being thrown into this high voltage bucket of TRR costs. So, certainly your point's well taken on that may cause some discrepancy or issue, but, I think that that's just a necessary outcome of this agreement with VEA to have them be joining. And, I don't really want to try to relitigate that discussion at this point in time, but, that your point's well taken. So, any final issue or clarification or point you'd like to make on how we might want to consider that in the future, Kanya?
I don't know how to allocate this fairly and I'm just trying to get at that if VA's low voltage transmission investments are included in the high voltage TAC, that means that investments that may have been specifically just to serve their morning peak are being socialized, and then they don't end up paying for that peak if we use a coincident peak measurement. That's just my concern. Is there's this one PTO where they have a totally different peak and their low voltage is included. So I'm just raising this issue.
Okay.
I don't know what the solution is. I'm just raising the issue.
Okay. Well, I think, we appreciate the comment and the concern there, the potential issue that's raised. I think the ISO at this point is willing to live with that possible discrepancy through this proposed process change. And the reason for that is because there'll still be a significant proportion of their load being allocated costs based on their volumetric usage. And so we don't think that it's totally inappropriate to apply that to these entities. But your point's well taken that they may not, they may have some different costs that are included there than some others. So there may be some different for them if you were just to compare the pure cost allocation and cost driver issues here. But I think that's something the ISO is willing to live with at this point. So thanks for your comment. And David wants to make another clarifying point on this, so I'll turn it over to him.
Yeah, so if you look at the most recent transmission access charge posting, high voltage, you'll see VEA has zero transmission revenue requirement, but they do have load. So they are going to be paying TAC. You'll see that there's an entity called GWT, which is Grid Alliance. They have about $20 million in TRR and no load because and that is strictly high voltage that Grid Alliance has. They did not buy any low voltage, they bought only the high voltage system from VEA. So I don't believe, and I don't know where it would show up, there's any low voltage facilities in the TAC from the VEA.
Okay, and to be very clear about how to find that, you could go into the low voltage rate and see if VEA has numbers there for their TRR for the low voltage piece, because that is also listed separately.
Yeah. So there's about $3.5 million of low voltage based TRR for VEA.
Okay. So thanks for that clarification and for doing some little legwork there for me in intra-meeting and helping me out with that. But yeah, I think that again, regardless of if there's some issue with that or not, I think the ISO is going to push forward with this proposal and not try to address that issue in particular. Paul, do you have a comment?
Yeah, Paul Nelson on behalf of CLECA. I mean, if I understand CalPA's concern that perhaps back in the time some low voltage costs were placed in the high. If that's accurate, I don't know. It's not my expertise, but there was a decision made on that, and perhaps the current volumetric only was considered a reasonable cost recovery. I think she's got a legitimate concern in switching to this new form. Perhaps that shift specific to VEA may no longer be an appropriate cost recovery because of the unique situation of what was done, what may have been done with the low voltage.
Oh yeah, that's a fair point, Paul. I would disagree that there may be an issue there, but I think as this other issue shows that now these assets have changed hands as well. There's a lot of historic, I'd say deal making that may have occurred to get VEA to join the ISO, and as part of that, we may have accepted a different allocation treatment that I'm sure was approved by FERC under settlement or something. So I don't think we're trying to relitigate that issue at this point, but if there is a, really large discrepancy that isn't reflected in the 12CP approach for VEA, at least the overall load here is pretty low. They're less than 1% of the load, and so the, costs associated with that would be pretty low as well. So it's really the only good response I have at this point on that issue itself. But with that, we're just hitting up against lunchtime, and I've got probably another 20 slides or so, I think, to go. As much as I wanted to get through this before lunchtime, we had a lot of good discussion, actually. So I think this might be a good time to take a break. Let's see. Let's go ahead and take a break here, and we'll pick back up here on slide 35 when we get back from lunchtime. And Jimmy, we're scheduled to go to 1 for lunch, right? Yeah, so we'll be back shortly after 1 to start the rest of the discussions today. All right, thanks.